Hello and welcome back to Cult Leader. I'm your cult leader, Spencer Henry, and today's case, I'm going to give a trigger warning for child loss. The case heavily involves children, and it's one that I didn't think I would actually ever cover on this show. However, due to recent events and recent information being released about this case, I was like, oh, well, this is absolutely a case that fits perfectly in line with Cult Leader. So today we are going to be talking about the Andrea Yates case. It's one that has brought and continues to bring a lot of conversation around postpartum depression. And I think it's something that is so important to talk about and isn't, frankly, talked about enough. I may not be the voice for postpartum depression. However, I have many people in my life who I know have struggled in some way after giving birth with depression or anxiety or just all of the thoughts, the OCDs, everything. And it's really fucking hard. And I think a lot of people try and put on a brave face because they're like, well, I don't want to seem like I'm not grateful to be a mom or grateful to giving birth, or I need to be strong and put on this front. When in reality, I think it's such a natural thing. I can't think of anything more natural than to have a surplus of anxiety or mixed feelings after giving birth. And then I'm sure there's guilt as a contributing factor as well for feeling depressed or maybe not feeling super excited. But it's a big life change. And anytime you go through any sort of big change in life, it comes with a lot of complicated feelings, even if it's a good thing. I just really hope that if any of you are or have dealt with postpartum depression, that you've had somebody that you can lean on to talk to about it. Surefire sign of a safe, healthy relationship is knowing that no matter what thoughts you're having, you're able to vocalize those with your partner. If you don't have a partner, being able to vocalize it with friends, family, some sort of support system is just of the utmost importance. However, today's story is sort of a mixture of, in my opinion, postpartum depression, but also extreme psychosis, religious psychosis even. And I think that's the part of this case that I didn't really understand. I remember, I'll come back to this at some point as I'm going through the story today, but I remember vividly 10-year-old me, I must have been around 10 years old. I remember being in my parents' backyard and there was a People magazine, and that magazine had a picture of Andrea Yates on the cover. And I remember sitting, opening it up, reading through it. And obviously it's a very shocking story, especially for a 10-year-old. However, I grew up in a house where I had a Dateline mom. Okay. Lulu, she was watching Dateline. She was also a Lifetime movie gal. So you see why I am the way that I am. And I will never forget hearing about the story, reading about this story. And I actually thought about it again recently. We were watching, the champ had never seen, oh gosh, I'm blanking. What's the Leonardo DiCaprio movie? Shutter Island. And obviously, if you've seen Shutter Island, I don't want to spoil anything, but it came out a really long time ago. There is a scene that involves drowning children. And it's so eerie because it feels so personal. Anytime we're dealing with any sort of strangulation or even stabbing, but like a drowning, I don't know, there's something that feels very personal about it. And especially when you think about somebody doing it continuously to multiple different people, it's horrific. So this case was recently brought into the spotlight again. I watched on HBO a multi-part docuseries about the case. And I think probably a lot of you who are around my age, maybe a little younger, a little older, will definitely remember this story. It centers around a 36-year-old mother named Andrea Yates, who did in fact drown all 5 of her children in the bathtub of the Houston area home that she shared with her husband. Noah was 7, John was 5, Paul 3, Luke 2, and Mary, the youngest of the Yates children, was just 6 months old at the time. It's going to be a tough one to get through. All 5 of these children were killed in the span of about an hour, in the gap between Andrea's husband leaving for work and her mother-in-law arriving that day to help with the children. Within hours, it was a national news story. The headlines were everywhere and you couldn't escape it. Stuff like "Monster or Madwoman" splashed across tabloids and cable news networks. Every article mentioned postpartum depression. Some mentioned extreme religious beliefs, but almost all of them ran the same photos of Andrea, Her blunt cut bangs, pale skin, and that flat, empty stare. That's basically where the public story stopped for a lot of people, myself included. She was a crazy mom who did the unthinkable. What I didn't realize at the time, and what I don't think most casual followers of the case ever realized, is that there was something much more disturbing happening behind the story. Not just extreme religious beliefs, but a highly controlled belief system that shaped how Andrea understood motherhood, how she understood sin, obedience, and salvation itself. That part of the story barely made it into headlines at the time, and when it did, it was usually flattened into vague phrases like religious influence or spiritual advisor. But when you actually trace it backward through letters, cassette tapes, testimony, medical records, and survivor accounts, it becomes hard to ignore. But let me not get too ahead of myself. To understand how 5 children ended up in that bathtub in June of 2001, you really have to go back years earlier. So we're going to rewind to 1989. That's when a then Andrea Kennedy met Rusty Yates in Houston. Andrea and Rusty. Andrea had actually grown up in Houston, and she was the youngest of 5 kids herself in a pretty traditional Catholic household. The kind where achievement mattered, rules mattered, and emotions weren't really the point. You did well, you behaved well, you didn't rock the boat. And Andrea was, by all accounts, the ideal daughter. She was a valedictorian, the swim team captain, a member of the National Honor Society, who went on to get her nursing degree. She worked at MD Anderson, one of the top cancer hospitals in the country. But as it often goes with perfectionists, there was more going on under the surface. As a teenager, Andrea had struggled a lot with bulimia and periods of depression. Friends later described her as insecure, eager to please, and extremely hard on herself. She didn't rebel, but she internalized everything. If something felt wrong, she assumed she was the problem and just needed to try harder. When Andrea did meet Rusty Yates, he was working toward what would become a long career as an electrical engineer with NASA. He was reserved, highly intelligent, very analytical, and very confident in his worldview. Spiritually, Rusty believed there were right ways to live and wrong ones, and that most people were getting it wrong. He valued discipline, he valued order and structure. He believed husbands should lead, wives should focus on the home, and families should be insulated from what he saw as corrupting outside influences. We've heard this song before, Cold Babes. While they were dating, Rusty introduced Andrea to the teachings of a traveling street preacher named Michael Woroniecki. Rusty had been familiar with Woroniecki's material for years, the pamphlets, letters, cassette tapes, and viewed him as a kind of rebellious spiritual authority. Someone who said uncomfortable things that other Christians were too soft, too modern, or too compromised to say out loud. And I have to pause because I was watching that docuseries and they talked about Andrea and her guidance from this man, Michael Woroniecki. And I was like, oh my God, we've definitely talked about this man before. And I was like, I know it was during the Satanic Panic era, but I was mixing him up because remember we had Mike Woroniecki? Very similar. Michael Woroniecki and Mike Woroniecki. 2 different people, both very extreme with their religious beliefs. But when I was searching for it, funny enough, I typed in Woroniecki into the notes app on my phone. And I pulled up this note that I had started 4 years ago. And I guess I started writing an episode about this case and just never came back to it. So for some reason, now was the time. And I was able to actually incorporate some of the things that I wanted to talk about the first time around in this current time. So I'm glad that I waited a little bit. But these extreme beliefs, Rusty following this Michael Woroniecki guy's guidance or playbook, it didn't scare Andrea off. Because if anything, it gave her more rules to hold on to, more structure, more certainty, a clearer sense that if she followed the right formula closely enough, life and God would finally make sense to her. Something about it really resonated with her. In April of 1993, Andrea Kennedy and Rusty Yates got married. They told friends and family right away that they weren't going to use birth control because they planned to have as many children as God allowed. A guiding principle drawn directly from the belief system that Rusty got through Michael Woroniecki's teachings. 10 months later, their first child, Noah, was born. Andrea left her nursing career to stay home full-time, and then, Just 9 months later, almost like clockwork, baby John followed in December of 1995. I'm like, God, they're fucking getting to the point. Her body, I mean, you need time to recover. But at this stage, everyone around them still seemed genuinely fine. Andrea loved being a mother. Friends described her as attentive, gentle, and deeply devoted to her children. She was proud of them. She threw herself into this role as a mother the same way that she had fully thrown herself into school and work. Fully, intensely, determined to do it right. But Andrea wasn't as fine inside as she looked on the outside. By 1996, she was starting to crack a little bit. She had 2 babies under 2. That's fucking hard. She was home full time. Her world had gotten very small very fast. No coworkers anymore to chat around with, fewer friends, no real church community to lean on, just the house, the kids, the Bible, and the constant internal pressure to live up to these impossible standards that are sometimes set when you are part of an organized religion like this. That's a big life change, like we were talking about in the beginning of the episode. I shouldn't say her world got smaller, because it definitely didn't get smaller with the children, but her social life obviously shrank a little bit because now she has these 2 under 2 to take care of, and her whole world is inside of the confines of her home. Another thing that I think a lot of new moms struggle with. I mean, I remember, and I never have forgotten this, but I remember talking to one of my friends after she had her son. We were just talking about just how drastically different her life had become, for better and for worse. And she said to me, she's like, I think the hardest part is just the day to day. It's like, if I just want to go to Starbucks and get a coffee, it's such a fucking ordeal. Like I either have to like do the full production of getting him up in the car, setting that all up, getting him out of the car to go inside. The freedom that you lose. I think that's a hard feeling. She did take it upon herself to reach out to people, including Michael Woroniecki's wife. Her name was Rachel. And she wrote this letter to Rachel, basically describing feeling very lonely and very isolated. And she wrote it very carefully, almost apologetically, the way a lot of women do when they're already blaming themselves for struggling. Like, she didn't want to complain. She just wanted reassurance that she wasn't failing as a mother. She was looking, I believe, for some sense of reassurance. And Rachel's response was not comforting in the way that most people would expect comfort. Instead of encouraging Andrea to seek support, rest, or community, Rachel pointed her back toward doctrine. She highlighted obedience, submission, and a woman's role as a wife and mother. She reminded Andrea that her duty was to her husband and children, and that fulfillment would come through quiet faithfulness and staying within that role. The message boiled down was essentially, if you're lonely, you need to be more faithful. Because this was a family that Rusty trusted so much, and because Andrea was already primed to believe that struggle meant personal failure, she took it very seriously. She took those words verbatim. So let's pause here, because to understand why Andrea's mental illness didn't just go untreated, but in some ways became reinforced, you have to understand who exactly the Woronieckis were and what they were actually preaching to people like Andrea and Rusty. Michael Woroniecki was born in 1954 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He grew up Catholic, serving as an altar boy, and in the early 1970s, his mother became involved in the Catholic charismatic movement, which really leaned heavily on emotional conversion experiences, spiritual warfare, if you will, and being born again. Between 1972 and 1976, Michael attended Central Michigan University, where he studied psychology and played college football. He liked to talk about his physical strength back then, the weight that he could bench, how fast he could run, and he also liked to talk about how wild he was. He was drinking, he was fighting, he was showing off, maybe pride, sin. He'd experienced all of it. In 1974, Michael suffered a serious football injury that ended his athletic trajectory. According to him, this injury became his spiritual turning point. He framed it as God was humbling him, stripping him away from his ego, and calling him to a higher purpose. From that point forward, he increasingly described himself as someone specially chosen to deliver hard truths that others refused to say. In 1979, he ended up marrying Leslie Jean Ochalik, who later changed her name to the very deliberately biblical Rachel Rebecca Woroniecki. Rachel and Rebecca are two of the most important matriarchs in the book of Genesis and closely associated with motherhood, divine election, and the continuation of God's covenant through their children. So that kind of gives you an idea of the level of delusion that we're dealing with. All right. In 1980, Michael earned a Master of Divinity from Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California, one of my favorite cities, a well-known evangelical school that has been very influential in modern American evangelical circles for years and years and years. But instead of settling into anything resembling a conventional ministry, he quickly decided that most institutional churches were compromised already. They were spiritually dead or outright corrupt. He rejected pastors, denominations, and church buildings altogether. What he formed instead was called the Cornerstone Christian Fellowship, and this wasn't a church in the normal sense or traditional sense, but it was a loose, personality-driven ministry, really centered entirely around him and whatever city he happened to be standing in that day. For lack of a better word, it was a grift. All right, it was a grift. He took to street preaching almost immediately. Sidewalks, campuses, festivals, sporting events, anywhere that people gathered, Michael went. He carried banners with him and a large wooden cross, openly confronting strangers about sin, judgment, and damnation. This approach repeatedly brought him into conflict with police and city officials in Grand Rapids especially. He was arrested multiple times for disorderly conduct as well as public disturbance. The guy's a fucking nuisance, all right? By the early 80s, local authorities had had enough. Under informal pressure to stop causing problems, Michael effectively left the city altogether and took his preaching to the road. He's like, all right, you don't want me here? I'm out of here. Okay, it's time for the traveling evangelist. By the mid to late 80s, the Woronieckis were living a fully nomadic lifestyle. They traveled in a converted bus, lived on donations from their followers, whatever you want to call them, congregation. They homeschooled their growing number of children and preached wherever crowds gathered. Michael churned out handwritten pamphlets and tracts, which he mailed out regularly and passed hand to hand to people walking by. Each one focused on the same ideas again and again. The world was on the brink of judgment. Total submission to God was non-negotiable. Mothers, you're personally responsible for whether your children are saved. And he said that pretty much everything mainstream, including other churches, was under Satan's control. Everything. Colleges, hospitals, social institutions, even other Christians were all distractions and demonic. I mean, we've done enough episodes by now to know that none of this was especially new, right? It pulls straight from existing fundamentalist and apocalyptic playbooks. We've got that doomsday daydream, baby. And what made it land at the time was really his delivery, because he had that confidence we've talked about with his message. He was out there like, if your life sucks, you just need to submit to God. I can help. And for young people that were already anxious, isolated, or searching for answers, guidance, anything, he could make it seem like that message was sent just for them. You're the chosen one. God is speaking through me to get to you. And that's where Rusty Yates comes into the story. That's how he met Michael. I think he was in college at the time. And Rusty has always minimized how deep that involvement went, insisting it wasn't a cult and that he wasn't fully into it. But the paper trail tells a different story. He stayed in contact long enough to correspond by mail, absorb the theology, accept spiritual correction, donate money, and eventually introduce Andrea to it. He brought the teachings into his marriage, into his parenting, into the way that he structured his family life. At one point, he even sold nearly everything he owned, trying to live out the model that Woroniecki promoted. Yep, not a cult. Huh? You see, by the early 1990s, the Woronieckis weren't just preaching, they were using themselves as proof of concept for a new way of family living. And this is what's interesting about this specific cult model, and maybe why at the time everyone was hesitant to call it a cult at all. There wasn't a compound, per se. There was no real community feel. It wasn't like the Children of God or even Spawn Ranch, right? The family. It was all very nomadic and isolated. Singular family unit only. And the way to do it best was bus living. That meant constant travel, homeschooling, minimal contact with extended family was the best way to bring up children. That is what they preached. And public confrontation with the world. Street preaching. That's the way to salvation, telling others about the impending doom. So from about 1992 to 1996, the Woroniecki family was almost never in one place. They crisscrossed the US and traveled internationally through Europe and North Africa, preaching in city centers and public squares alike, including places like Morocco, where public Christian preaching was actually illegal and sometimes ended in arrest, interrogations, or being ordered out of the country altogether. But to them, this was proof that they were doing God's work, and they weren't going to let the devil slow them down. By 96, the Yates family started moving in the same direction. If Andrea was already feeling like something in her life wasn't working, this must have looked like an answer. The Woroniecki's were thriving. So Andrea and Rusty actually sold their house, got rid of most of their belongings, and moved into a trailer. The following year in 1997, Andrea gave birth to Paul. And the correspondence with the Woroniecki's continued on with letters, encouragement, and little reminders of their shared worldview. In 1998, the Woroniecki's sold the converted bus that they had been living in to the Yates family. Okay, so this is a strong connection here between these two families. It's not just some random person in their life. Rusty later claimed that the decision actually came from Andrea and the kids and that he was outvoted. But either way, the move was a turning point. Living conditions became tighter, more restrictive, and far more isolating from the outside world. Andrea's world just kept shrinking. Fewer people, fewer reference points, less room to be anything other than a wife, mother, homemaker, and most importantly, the spiritual gatekeeper for her children's souls. Rusty would later say they were happy then, and things weren't bad yet. And maybe on the surface that's true, but I can only imagine once a mother fully accepts the idea that they're personally responsible for whether her children end up in heaven or hell, there's no such thing as a small failure anymore. That's a lot of pressure to put on someone, especially somebody dealing with postpartum. Every moment of anger, exhaustion, doubt, or imperfection has to start to feel like eternal consequences. And Andrea was very, very good at blaming herself. And as I mentioned, Rachel's letters that she would correspond with her back and forth through weren't very helpful. The Yates family weren't the only ones who took this worldview seriously. Other families did the same thing, including the Storm family, who were actually related to the Woroniecki's. Children in the Storm family, including Moses Storm, who later helped produce the docuseries I watched, The Cult Behind the Killer, have described growing up in a constant state of fear that hell was real, judgment was imminent, and that the end of the world always felt like it was just around the corner. Like the Woroniecki's, the Storm family also lived out of an RV, moving from place to place. The kids were pushed into insane street preaching at an age where they barely understood what they were saying. I mean, it reminds me of, what's that awful group? The God Hates Fag people. I don't know. You know what I'm talking about. We've done an episode on it. But not long after this, in February of 1999, Andrea gave birth to her fourth child, Luke. And after Luke was born, the wheels on the bus really did start to come off. What initially looked like postpartum depression quickly slid into something much darker and more dangerous. By June, Andrea was barely functioning. She had stopped talking. She just stared blankly at the walls. She picked at her skin until it bled. She scratched bald spots into her scalp, stopped eating. Sometimes she didn't feed the baby. When doctors asked what was wrong, she said she was just overwhelmed and exhausted, which was true, but she didn't tell them she was terrified of her own thoughts and what she might do. But eventually, it broke her. She could only push it under wraps for so long. Andrea attempted suicide for the first time. She overdosed on medication and was rushed to the hospital. And during that hospitalization, Andrea admitted that she was afraid that she might hurt her children. She described intrusive thoughts, disturbing images, and this overpowering belief that she was evil. She was defective, unfit to be a mother. One of the social workers at the hospital was alarmed enough by Andrea's mental state, the children's ages, and the family's living conditions to go ahead and notify CPS, the Child Protective Services. But the report says it was quickly closed, and CPS didn't stay involved for whatever reason. In late July, her condition worsened so badly that Rusty found her in the bathroom holding a knife to her neck, not moving, just frozen. That led her to being admitted to the Spring Shadows Glen, a private psychiatric hospital in Houston. At Spring Shadows, Andrea deteriorated further before she improved. At times, she was nearly catatonic. She barely spoke. She resisted eating. She resisted treatment. She scratched at her body compulsively, pulling hair from her scalp, picking at her skin till it bled. Doctors documented the psychosis, hallucinations, delusions, and intense fixation on sin, salvation, and damnation. Andrea believed that Satan could actually hear her if she spoke certain thoughts out loud. She believed she may have already ruined her children spiritually, stolen them from salvation, and she believed that even acknowledging her fears might make them come true. And then Andrea was finally given a prescription for Haldol, a powerful antipsychotic, and she improved fast. Almost overnight, she became responsive again. She talked, she bathed, she ate, she could function. It saved her life. Doctors and family members were concerned about the bigger picture, however. Their living conditions. I mean, this bus it wasn't healthy. It wasn't sustainable. It was unsafe, too small, too isolating. Andrea needed stability. She needed space and near constant supervision if she had any chance at making a full recovery. In August of 1999, Rusty used part of his NASA salary to buy a 3-bedroom house at 942 Beachcomber Lane. That finally ended the bus experiment. Doctors were also crystal clear about something else. A very important warning: no more pregnancies. Another birth would almost certainly trigger another psychotic break. And for a while, this change really seemed to work. In the house, Andrea looked more like herself again. She was baking, she swam laps, she laughed with the kids, she sewed. On the surface, it looked like she had made a recovery. But underneath that, the warning signs never fully went away. Andrea stopped taking her psychiatric medication later in 1999, and despite repeated medical warnings, Rusty still believed another pregnancy was worth the risk if that's what God wanted. He later brushed off Andrea's earlier breakdown as being like the flu, something serious but temporary if treated. Thus, Andrea did get pregnant again, and on November 30th of 2000, baby Mary was born. Andrea now had 5 children under the age of 7 and a documented history of postpartum depression and psychosis to boot. Exactly the scenario her doctors had warned against. And as expected, whatever brief stability Andrea had regained didn't last. In early 2001, her father died, and almost immediately afterward, she began to unravel again. She started to completely withdraw. She stopped speaking. She stared at nothing for long stretches of time, and she became convinced that she was evil, that Satan was inside of her, and that she had failed God completely. During this period, letters and cassette tapes from the Woroniecki's continued to arrive at the doorstep of the Yates family. She would listen to them, but they didn't comfort her. They fed her the same ideas that fed her psychosis. You can't let the devil win. By spring of 2001, Andrea was back in and out of psychiatric care. This time she landed at Devereaux, Texas Treatment Network. Her condition was severe. Doctors discussed electroconvulsive therapy as a last resort option. Rusty refused it, however. He also supported pulling Andrea out of structured treatment early, backing her decision to leave partial hospitalization after only just a few days. When she began tapering off her antipsychotic medication once again, he supported that as well. Andrea was discharged while still withdrawn, flat, minimally communicative, and increasingly trapped in religious delusions. But he supported that too. He was just a supportive guy, okay? I don't know. I got really angry with him at certain points in the docuseries, and I'm not blaming him whatsoever, but I don't know. I don't think anybody could have predicted what was going to happen. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, Rusty left for work as usual. He later told police that Andrea seemed off. As he left that day, he had seen her standing in the kitchen, eating dry cereal straight from the box, staring off into space. But he believed his mother Dora would be arriving later that morning to help with the kids. So he didn't worry about it and just went off to work. After he left, Andrea proceeded to drown all 5 children in the bathtub, one by one. Afterward, she left the youngest laying in the bathtub while the others were laid out under a sheet. When it was over, she picked up the phone and called 911. She asked them to send an officer right away. She didn't try to run. She didn't try and fight or over-explain why she had done what she had done. She later did explain that she believed she was saving her children from eternal damnation because in her mind, they were already spiritually doomed because of her failures as a mother. Death, she believed, was the only way to spare them from hell. And this was according to the Woroniecki teachings. They taught that children are innocent until they're 12 years old, and after that, they're doomed to hell. So part of her must have thought she was getting them in before it was too late. Moses Storm, who was in that docuseries, admitted he was jealous they got in before his family could, because the Woroniecki ideology also emphasized scarcity. Salvation wasn't for everyone. It was for a tiny remnant, like in the days of Noah, 8 souls saved on the ark. Everyone else would be destroyed. So Andrea believed she was running out of time and took matters into her own hands. She was arrested that same day and charged with capital murder, and the case immediately became national news. During the investigation and trial, Andrea's religious beliefs became unavoidable. Her doctors, attorneys, investigators all recognized that her psychosis wasn't random. It was made worse by the religious material she had been consuming. Prosecutors and defense attorneys produced materials connected to Michael Woroniecki, including his pamphlets, letters, and cassette tapes. These weren't presented to argue that religion itself caused the crime, but to explain what Andrea believed when she was going through this religious psychosis. They helped show the jury the internal logic of her delusions, how sin, damnation, motherhood, and salvation had fused into something lethal. But still, in Andrea's first trial, that context never fully landed. When the case went to trial in February of 2002, the public mood was fucking brutal. I mean, the image of this mother killing her children was so horrifying, so ghastly, that many people simply could not accept an insanity defense, no matter how severe the mental illness actually was. Multiple psychiatrists testified that Andrea was actively psychotic at the time of the killings. They described hallucinations, fixed delusions, disorganized thinking, and just a complete break from reality. But the prosecution leaned really hard into the idea of intent. They emphasized that Andrea knew what she was doing was illegal, that she waited that day until Rusty left for work. She called 911 afterward, spoke calmly to police, and to many jurors, those facts felt incompatible with insanity. Even though the legal standard for insanity is not whether someone knows an act is illegal, but whether they understand it is morally wrong. The moment that tipped the balance came from prosecution expert Dr. Park Dietz. Dietz had testified that Andrea may have been inspired by an episode of Law & Order in which a woman drowned her children and was later found not guilty by reason of insanity. He suggested that Andrea could have watched the episode and modeled her crime, even her defense after it. The implication was that Andrea wasn't truly psychotic, but rather instead extremely manipulative. Jurors later did acknowledge that testimony played a huge role in rejecting the insanity defense. But there was just one problem. The episode that Dietz had described never existed. There was no Law & Order storyline that ever aired. In 2005, the Texas Court of Appeals overturned Andrea's conviction, ruling that Dietz's testimony was false, materially misleading, and likely influenced the jury's verdict at the time. The court held that Andrea had been denied a fair trial. By the time Andrea was retried in 2006, the atmosphere was completely different. The second trial focused much more carefully on Andrea's internal reality. The defense made a clearer distinction between legal knowledge and moral understanding, and crucially, the jury was given more context for Andrea's religious delusions. This time around, expert testimony from Dr. Philip Resnick played a central role. Dr. Resnick, who had evaluated Andrea shortly after the killings, testified that her psychosis was severe, sustained, and deeply structured by her religious beliefs. He described her conviction that Satan lived inside her and that she was marked as evil and that her children were doomed because of her failures as a mother. Dr. Resnick also famously described Andrea's religion as the trellis upon which the ivy of her mental illness grew. The illness was real. The beliefs didn't create it, but they surely helped shape it. During the deliberations, jurors reviewed Woroniecki's newsletter, The Perilous Times, which had been found in the Yates home. Reading it in full helped them understand how Andrea's beliefs about the age of accountability, parental responsibility, and eternal damnation could form a coherent, if horrifying, delusional system. And for several jurors, they said that this was the moment that things really clicked for them. After days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. Andrea wasn't sent back to prison. She was instead committed to a state psychiatric hospital, where she remains today, under close supervision and periodic evaluations that have continued to find that she meets the criteria for involuntary commitment. She's never been released, nor should she be. I believe that she is where she should be, and that's kept safely supervised. Rusty Yates eventually divorced Andrea. He remarried and started a new family. However, he's always maintained that Andrea's actions were the result of severe mental illness, which every psychiatrist who evaluated her agreed with. At the same time, he's often downplayed how serious her earlier breakdowns were and how risky her final discharge actually was. As for Michael Woroniecki and his wife, they've consistently denied any responsibility for what happened. His materials were never ruled illegal and no criminal charges were ever brought against him, but survivor accounts, court testimony, and documentary evidence have made it pretty clear that his ideology shaped the content of Andrea's delusions. You can't argue that. And that plenty of other families who had been not working, but worshiping, I guess, under the Woroniecki's or had been harmed by the same belief system. His website, still up and running to this day, just seems pretty backwards to me. And that, my friends, is the story of Andrea Yates. Rest in peace to those children. It's one of those things where I feel like I don't really know who to blame, but I do think in regards to the children, they were just failed. It was so clear based on her history that Andrea had struggled so significantly, and it feels like a lot of it was disregarded. But that is where we're going to leave things for the week. I will see you next time. And until next time, even if your wife's religious psychosis is just a maybe don't add another baby. Goodbye.